My fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day. Waiting for a long time. April 2nd, 2025 will forever be remembered as the day American industry was reborn, the day America's destiny was reclaimed, and the day that we began to make America wealthy again. We're going to make it wealthy, good and wealthy.
Happy Liberation Day.
Oh, are you feeling free or what?
I have not felt so free since 2008, let me tell
Yeah.
you. I don't know. You're in LA now. I don't know whether there's some kind of lag time there, but in New York, I just came out of the subway and people are literally standing around the street looking at the Dow Jones on their phone.
Yeah. Well, here in LA, you wake up and the market's already started usually.
Right.
And to wake up and open your phone and see that is the first image that greets you. And then, of course, to see what it's done all day.
Yeah.
This is wild and scary.
It is wild.
And dangerous.
It is wild and scary, particularly for those of us who are retired and watching
Yep.
our 401ks dwindle. And even though intellectually you're probably going to get it back, it's not pretty for the time being, let me tell you.
Nope.
Okay, well, the big news before we get to our focus today, which is, of course, the tariffs that caused this whole situation, the big news is the special elections on Tuesday. I wrote something about it, and I'll link to that in this post, viewers. But in Wisconsin, the Republicans apparently thought they had met their voter targets to win the state Supreme Court seat, but Democrats out-hustled them, despite the fact that a right-wing group called Look Ahead America was texting photos of scantily clad models to prospective voters. The significance of winning this court seat is pretty big, isn't it, Neil?
For sure, because so much more hangs in the balance because of this, right? Decisions about how the state is apportioned, or how essentially the Republican plan to gerrymander the state, and to deliver even more, basically to turn the state into a Republican stronghold by, manipulating the map. And so this is an enormous consequence, but I also think it's enormous in terms of hopefully the message it's sent to Elon Musk, and I think just the Republicans in general right now, about him as an effective political strategist in these places. Maybe we should want him to go to more places and actually prove to be even more ineffective. But it definitely was a rebuke of him. And I think what's interesting is sort of the comments, and you wrote a great piece about this, the way in which he actually may serve to generate a different response from voters who aren't yet willing to turn on Trump because of their cultic, connection to him. But, that if Elon Musk becomes the face of this, Republicans may really, really hurt.
Right. And of course, one of the things we know is that Elon Musk had a special interest in this election because he was suing the state of Wisconsin to allow his Tesla dealerships to operate there as they do in other states. And apparently, Wisconsin has a law that you cannot sell direct to buyers. A company can't sell direct to buyers. And of course, that is part of Tesla's model. So he had a real interest in flipping this seat to conservatives. It gives Wisconsin a liberal majority on its court until 2028. So you're right, reapportionment. But I would also say that it's a heartening example of how a state can actually turn something around, because 6 or 7 years ago, it looked like Wisconsin was lost, that it was going to be red forever. And the Democratic Party in that state has really clawed its way back in.
Yeah, and so much credit is being given to the state Democratic leader there, whose name I'm blanking on right now, but who's very well regarded for the ground game that has been built there, and hopefully is developing a model that's exportable to other places. Florida could certainly use some help there, although I think we see some good news even in these losses there, which we'll talk about in a second. But yeah, Wisconsin easily could have fallen in like a deep red, into the deep red camp.
Right.
And the Democrats didn't give up on it. Obviously, there was real good reason for them not to. but also it required investment and good strategy and a good, ground game, and they did all of those things.
Right. And lest it be forgotten, the right to abortion is now safe in Wisconsin for the near future, which is also a relief. So let's turn to Florida ever so briefly, Neil. And I'm going to toss the ball to you because you're our local Florida man. What was significant about two elections in Florida, special elections to fill Republican held seats? The Democrats lost, but sometimes when you lose, you win.
Well, I don't think there are any moral victories in sports or in politics, and I especially don't feel that way as I'm heading into Final Four weekend, and my beloved Duke Blue Devils are in the semifinals. So you got to score more points in order to win in a way that really matters. But if politics is a marathon, not a sprint, there are some really good signs here, because in both of these elections, they were not tight, they were not close, but the enormous Republican advantage that has been historically true in both of these districts,
Right.
and it was especially true just recently in the presidential election, have been incredibly um, decreased. Democrats gained by like 20 something points in these districts, I think, sort of on average, and some of the sort of sub districts did even better. And so there's huge Democratic growth here. Also, perhaps suppressed Republican turnout, but that's not insignificant either. I mean, the
Right.
Republicans are sort of making a big deal about that. Oh, our voters didn't really turn out. Well, why didn't they?
Right.
Usually parties don't sort of put that forward as an excuse. They worry about what it means for elections down the line. And, Democrats are not going to win in those two districts in Florida, probably. But is this a good sign for um, an improving status for Democrats in the state of Florida? I think absolutely. And that's a state where the party has really, really suffered over the last 20 years, such to the extent that a year or two ago, I think people were about to pronounce it dead. This is huge new life for it, and they should build on it and hopefully change some things. They're not going to turn Florida blue necessarily anytime soon, but if they can make it a battleground state again, that would be an enormous transformation that would have real consequences for national strategy.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the pieces of this that I was particularly interested in, Neil, is Florida 01, which was Matt Gates's district,
Yeah,
which is in the Panhandle. Escambia County went Democrat,
I couldn't
plus
believe it.
3 Democrat. And, what's unusual about that, to say the least, is smack in the middle of Escambia County is Pensacola, which is a huge, sprawling airfield. There are, tens of thousands of military veterans that live in Escambia County, people who work for the military. And one of the things I'm starting to wonder is whether there is some roiling dissatisfaction in the military about what the Trump administration is doing.
How could there not be with everything that's happening? I mean, you have just benefits on one hand, the veteran affairs being gutted, real fears about what this means for, providing for our servicemen and women. And I think those are deeply felt and they should be scared about it. But then you also have all this sort of national security stuff in the military policy that we talked about recently. I think it was last week with the signal chat, right?
Right.
I don't think anyone who's connected to the military and who worries about, issues of national security and global stability, who can look at what's happening and have a sort of neutral position about it. But it is shocking to me that a place like Escambia County and that Pensacola, Florida, that's so deeply red, in large part because of those reasons you just said, the
Right.
huge military presence, could actually flip in a moment like this. And I guess we'll see how it looks going forward. But for Democrats to win in Escambia is historic. I mean, I think it was back to the 1960 presidential election was the last
Yep.
time
Yep.
Escambia voted for a
Yep.
Democrat, which would have been JFK. I mean,
Right. Right.
so, and also the entire South was voting pretty much for Democrats still then at the presidential level. So this is big. It's really big.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think we definitely have to keep our eye on Florida. So let's circle back to Elon Musk because we saw a report from Politico on Wednesday that Musk may be exiting Trump's inner circle. Now, he is supposed to be leaving his Doge position sometime in June, I think. But apparently, Trump has been talking to people and saying, really, maybe it's time for him to go. Do we think this was an actual leak, Neil, or a strategic leak? I mean, Trump can't risk ejecting Musk since he kind of serves as a heat shield and deflects public anger from Trump, and he's very popular among a certain subset of MAGA. But do we think this leak was sort of intended to prepare people for Elon going back to his troubled Tesla company?
Yes, I also think it might be a bit of a like chastening message to Musk to sort of reel in some of his behaviors indirectly. But I agree with you that, I mean, that's always been the interesting question was like, what was going to be the bigger issue or the bigger driver here? Was it going to be Musk, Trump's annoyance with Musk and the sort of clash of personalities, or was it going to be Trump's recognition that, as you said, Musk is a very convenient target that he can use as a shield? And I think it's been the latter that has proven to be the case. And I think there's, as the economy collapses and there's so many different things to attack Trump on, he probably thinks it's quite useful to have Musk around to bear a lot of the brunt of that. Certainly is how he's led his personal life, and how he's done most of his business transactions is to have other people who get the blame, or to take the heat. No reason to think that that's not why Musk continues to be useful for Trump for as long as he's willing to stick around.
Well, and I actually would guess that Susie Wiles,
Mm.
Trump's chief of staff, really doesn't like Elon Musk. Susie Wiles is a really interesting character who's famous for sort of fading into the background and exerting her power invisibly. And one of the things we do know about her agreeing to become his chief of staff is she had a whole set of rules about how things were going to run. And apparently, Musk has been violating all of those rules. And
Mm.
one of the things that she really doesn't like, and I do have this from an insider, is that, for example, that whole trip to Wisconsin was not cleared with her, and it wasn't cleared with the Trump White House. Elon just went to Wisconsin and did that without asking anybody. And so I think we can presume that Susie Wiles thinks that Elon is a bomb waiting to go off and she wants him gone.
And I think that Trump respects Wiles from what, I mean, there's from what we've sort of
Mm-hmm.
had reported around that. She definitely doesn't suffer fools, and she may be the only adult in the room. So, I think she's not in a normal Republican administration. There'd probably be lots of things to, lots of problems to have with her, but she may be the one rational actor here that's, and also that has, I think, Trump's ear in a way that might be consequential for Musk and his future. But imagine being the world's richest man and having to get clearance to go to Wisconsin to, hand out the money that you want to hand out. It's also a question like how much longer does Musk want to do this? He's already backing away from his involvement in Wisconsin. He's sort of reframing what all that was about. Now he's saying that the thing he really cared about was this, vote over the ballot initiative over voter ID, as if that's really
Right.
what
Right.
he was interested in. But he's obviously embarrassed, and we'll see how long he wants to continue doing this.
Yeah. And let's just say, I think we know Republicans are really upset about what happened in Wisconsin because they're going on X about the voter ID law,
Yeah,
which has in fact been in effect in Wisconsin for
exactly.
10 years. This vote was to put it in the state constitution. So there's no real victory here on voter ID.
Hmm.
So, speaking of leaks, the Neiman Center reported earlier this week that in its search for government leakers, ProPublica, which is doing a kick ass job reporting on this administration, purchased one of those trucks with an LED billboard that advertises ProPublica's signal number and an internet tip line on the side. And apparently, they park it outside agencies where government workers are being laid off so that everybody knows where they can go to give inside information. This is innovative, Neil.
Definitely. ProPublica is at the forefront of so much of, investigative journalism, and just the way that they, I think, are one of, the best places we can go to. And it's certainly a trusted resource these days. It does make me worried, because we have an administration that is so bent on retaliation and punishment against everyone. And certainly, Trump's obsession with, his notions of loyalty, which of course mean loyalty to him. I worry about those who are coming forward, because all of this seems to put them at risk, I think, for stuff coming down the line, but also how brave of them, and how much I think we're indebted to them for anything that they can bring forward to trusted news sources.
Yeah, there are going to be so many profiles in Courage when we get through this. ProPublica is definitely going to be one of them. And I just want to add something onto our news of the week, because it's hard to ignore it, which is the TikTok sale. And I just want to say to viewers, Neil is so popular on TikTok. When I put clips of this up on TikTok, everyone loves Neil. So I want to preserve TikTok. But part of what is bizarre about this is apparently Saturday is the new deadline for TikTok to either sell or shut down. And there's been a whole bidding war for TikTok going on in the White House, in the Oval Office. Now, at first it looked like Amazon was winning. Now it looks like Larry Ellison's Oracle is winning. And, I sort of had this moment where I thought, this is what all these guys wanted. They wanted TikTok. That's why they supported Trump. Is this going to happen, Neil?
Who knows, but it looks quite likely. And again, just what you have described is wild. That this is the business that's being conducted inside the Oval Office. It also makes me think, and I've thought this so many times, of, had Musk not been forced to go ahead with the purchase of Twitter, what sort of different political reality would we be living with now? Right. And TikTok getting in the hands of another one of these guys. I certainly don't think that they're as bad actors as Musk is, but
right.
I don't know. Maybe it's better than the Chinese owning it. I'm not sure, but pick your poison.
I don't know. At least the Chinese are in Myanmar picking bricks up off people. I think one of the things, I keep pushing the Sarah Wynne Williams book, Careless People, on this show, and I realize there are probably things wrong with it. But one of the things that really struck me after I finished it was actually, I think social media was always a terrible idea. Always, from the absolute get-go, because it's clear from that book that, for example, Facebook never actually cared about what happened to its audience. All they cared about was growing the audience. Right. All they cared was making money, So I think all of this is very tricky, but I think it is important that this is happening in the Oval Office. It's also Warren Harding. I think Warren Harding is like somewhere up in heaven, looking down and chortling. All right, so let's get to today's big story, which is tariffs. On Wednesday, Donald Trump announced a comprehensive list of tariffs on everything coming into the United States from absolutely everywhere, including apparently the Antarctic. As we record this, the Dow Jones is down 1,600 points, and markets are tumbling around the globe as investors react to the tariffs. In his EO, Trump has declared a national economic emergency, and that's the premise for this whole thing. And he's claiming authority from legislation passed in the Carter administration that has in fact been used 44 times. And apparently 39 of these emergencies have never been officially terminated. Neil, what are we to think about this? What's the bigger context for this event?
Well, there's people who think that this is all a deliberate ploy to crash the American economy so that he can consolidate power even more so. And this is an authoritarian playbook. And I'm definitely sympathetic to that argument, and also very worried about it, because it's being put forward by really smart people who look at this stuff really closely. So I think that's part of this. Um, is it also possible that Trump is just a big idiot and doesn't understand anything when it comes to global economics, and for whatever reason has this tariff obsession in his head and won't let go of it? I think the national economic emergency part of this deserves a little bit more focus from us, um, because, well, first of all, I'm curious what you think about his use of that, to justify what's taking place here. My understanding is the economic emergency is that we run a trade deficit with all of these countries, and he characterizes that as some sort of catastrophe. Um, but am I missing something here?
No, I think you've got it. I mean, I think the emergency is in an existential one in his
Right.
mind, that the United States is not at the center of the world operating the way it did before the 1970s. I think there's something else that's important here. Now, 1977 is the Carter administration, when there actually was the United States was going into a deep recession. I mean, we went from a soft economy to stagflation, and that was a big deal. But what's interesting to me is that because this act has been used so many times, it's part of the trend of pushing power into the Oval Office,
Right.
Congress sort of giving up its oversight, giving up some of its functions, and then never revisiting that there's no part of Congress that is responsible for going back over these things and saying, hey, did we ever end that economic emergency from 1988? And so I think that's very important. I think the second thing that's very important here is that Trump's idea of an emergency is about 3 decades too late.
Yep.
All of those factories are gone. All of those factory jobs are gone. And, what a lot of people are saying on radio and television and so on, experts, they're saying you can't just rebuild a factory and get it up and running in a few months. It takes years, it takes billions of dollars, and those billions of dollars are simply not going to be available. So Trump, and this is a sort of, I think, typical Republican wishful thinking about the economy. Trump thinks that, if he does this, a lot of companies will just wake up and say, oh, we'll get that auto parts factory out of Mexico and bring it back to Kansas or whatever. And that's not going to happen.
Right.
And so the question is, does he really believe it or not? Now, the Senate, interestingly enough, has responded very quickly by passing a bill to block the tariffs on Canada, at least, with 4 Republicans voting with the Democrats: Susan Collins of Maine, Rand Paul of Kentucky, right? Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. Probably 2 of those people. I mean, we know Mitch McConnell is not going to be back. We're pretty sure Susan Collins is not going to be back. But we're not sure about Rand Paul and Lisa Murkowski. So is there something that's starting to bubble up in the Republican Party to put the brakes on this stuff?
Well, I'm not sure that this is going to develop much beyond those 4. Certainly, this is, significant that the Senate is acting here, but this is dead on arrival once it hits the House, because
Right.
House Republicans are completely in the Trump tank. Although you would have to think that those senators have to represent, I mean, especially in the case of Kentucky, right? McConnell
Right.
and Paul are both really making this argument about bourbon. The fact that Kentucky
Right.
provides 95% of the world's supply of bourbon, that this is a multi-billion-dollar industry for a state that doesn't have a lot of other big industries. It can't be that only the 2 senators of Kentucky are concerned about this. I would imagine
Right.
that there are many Republican congressmen and women in that state who share those same worries about Kentucky's economic future. And maybe it's that, individual state economies that really feel the pinch of this start to shift a little bit here. It's just wild that this has to go into effect before Republicans act, because everyone knows the writing on the wall around this. This is an economic cliff that we're being pushed off of, and it's going to be disastrous for the most vulnerable, many of whom, are Trump's biggest supporters.
Right.
But yeah, we'll see.
Well, it's interesting because this is also obviously a puzzle piece in Trump's promise to his Republican populist base, as you're
Right.
suggesting, that they will be restored to this, what he's depicting as a golden age of middle class living, financed by good working class jobs. The tariff policy we're seeing enacted was laid out in an essay by Peter Navarro in the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025. But Neil, you know, you and I both come from middle class households. I think we both probably knew some people in college and in our schools who came from working class households. I never knew anybody whose parents worked in a factory who thought that was a good life. And they sent their kids to college so they wouldn't have to work in factories. So, when are we going to see this fantasy that all Americans want is to like get back on the line or get back in the
Yeah.
coal mine or whatever? I mean, it's why are Americans buying this?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think probably the biggest advocates or the biggest believers in that dream are the ones who actually have never worked in the fantasy itself, but that
Right.
sort of connect it with a golden age of America in their mind, in which there was, a robust manufacturing segment of the economy. I mean, I do think, there have been coal miners in West Virginia who've continued to make the case for their industry. I'm sure there's auto workers who also, would like to continue to have more opportunities there around factory line work. But is there a huge working class population in this country that wants to go into manufacturing factory work? I don't know that that's ever been really made visible in recent years by any sort of clear sign. But I think what you've tapped into is, and I don't think nostalgia is the right way to think about it, but like Trump has a particular vision that is fixed in a historical moment in time, and everything seems to like revolve around that as the thing to get back to. What I don't understand, though, is, I mean, you talked about, wanting to get back to sort of a pre-1970s where the US is the center of the world. How do these economic decisions and policies, which are protectionist, which are ultimately isolationist, put us back at the center of the world?
Right.
I mean, if anything, it's going to make us more marginalized, and make us marginalized when we are not. We may not be the center of the world and sort of economic power that we were at mid 20th century, but we're still the most dominant economic player on the globe. And none of this is stuff to like keep us, at the center of global markets. These are protectionist, isolationist moves. And I don't understand how those sorts of things align in whatever economic vision he has for what he's doing.
Hello, China.
Right.
So
Like, just hand it over to them.
just hand it over. Start taking Mandarin, kids. Well, let's get back into this history a little bit, Neil, because I think we talk about tariffs, and there are about 8 or 9 different kinds of tariffs, which we're not going to bore the audience going through, including, I'm not even sure I remember what most of them are. But Trump's tariff schedule is more or less what we call retaliatory tariffs. In
Right.
other words, tariffs that are enacted in response to what is perceived as an unfair trade practice in another country. And I think getting into this question of what the reality and what the fantasy is, we have to sort of go back in history to say that actually there was a very long period in American history in which tariffs were a critical revenue source for the United States. And in fact, okay, fun fact for everyone to tell their friends, first major piece of legislation passed after the Constitution was ratified was the so-called Hamilton Tariff of 1789, which was exactly enacted to protect new American industries, right?
Yes. As a brand new country that had no real trade partners, or at least no trade partnerships
Right.
and policies in place, tariffs were not a surprising policy to pursue, to, basically hold uh, British imports at bay, or at least drive up, the need for and the interest and the purchasing power of Americans around American products. This is not 1792 anymore, and there's obviously a very different global economy, but also an incredibly different global position of the U.S. than when it was only a year or two old. But you're right, tariffs were used over really through the 19th century, I think, as the U.S. to sort of leverage its power in very in power imbalanced scenarios, trade scenarios, that are not the case today, or at least don't operate in the same ways. And so I don't know. I mean, it's just his characterization of our trade deficit with these countries as us being taken advantage of,
Yep.
when most people, Americans even, when they go to the stores, think like this is, the opportunity of cheap products, cheap
Right.
stuff that
Right.
they like.
Right.
It's such a disconnect, with
Yeah.
how I think most people approach like their big box stores.
Right.
You
Well, and
know,
of course, one of the interesting things about tariffs, again, a fun little fact to tell your friends, is that tax collecting at the ports was a major source of political patronage.
hmm
So, if you organized your district to vote for the right party and that party got into power, you could then become the tax collector at the Port of New York, and you got a percentage of all the taxes that you collected. So people became rich collecting tariffs. Now at the same time, we sort of get into the 19th century, and in 1823, the United States is locked out of every market around the world. Colonialism is thriving. Europe is, taking over China, taking over Japan, taking over Africa. And James Monroe establishes the Monroe Doctrine. All right. People might remember this from their high school history textbooks. But what the Monroe Doctrine is a letter that James Monroe sends to everybody around the world and says, the United States is going to trade anywhere it wants to. So at the same time as we have this elaborate tariff structure that is supporting the United States, we also have the principle of free markets around the globe being established by the United States. And this is really the tension that's playing out today, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the Monroe Doctrine probably, obviously, as significant it was at the time, I mean, really is, in a way, is what shaped and was really central to American strategy in the 20th century.
Right.
And really the free market sort of consensus that arose in American politics across the 20th century. Um, so it's just, I don't know. And I think, it is worth remembering and having this conversation. It's not like Trump's politics are out of nowhere. I mean, there's elements of this stuff that I think we can see in Patrick Buchanan's
Yep.
politics in the 90s. I think some of this overlaps with Bernie Sanders' ideas of,
Yep.
labor protection and of bringing and of the sort of political and economic conditions to strengthen manufacturing at home. Um, so that's to say that tariffs and sort of politics around tariffs have had a political and intellectual support by folks on the right and folks on the left. I
Right.
think what we're seeing happening now is of an extreme that I do feel like is unprecedented in this history. And the sort of race to implement this all at once without any sort of congressional approval, any sort of, sort of strategy that's laid out over time, and that, has like disastrous market effects. I don't think any, Pat
Right.
Buchanan or Bernie Sanders or anyone else would have signed on to it in this form.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm glad you brought up Bernie Sanders, because one of the things I learned when I was stumping for Elizabeth Warren in 2016 was that Bernie Sanders is very popular throughout New England precisely because, and people tend not to think of New England this way,
Mm,
there were whole towns that were just hollowed out by the migration of manufacturing abroad.
hmm.
Various kinds of clothing factories, furniture
Sure.
factories, sock factories, and towns that have never really recovered from that. So I would like to say that although I find Trump's tariff policy misguided, wrong, and stupid, there is a kernel of it, as you're saying. This is a problem that has been ignored by both parties for a very, very long time, that there were people who were simply abandoned by corporations.
Yeah, and I think Trump is a genius at tapping into sort of the political element of that problem and the political possibility of that problem,
Yep.
and
Yep.
creating a new, populist constituency around him. Um, he spoke to them about real issues that had happened,
Yep.
but the question is what these policies actually do to change that, or to help those folks. And I don't think in any way that this is going to benefit them. It's from every economist is saying it's only going to make it worse for them. But it is worth remembering that, again, there is a politics and a political history that is relevant to the decisions he's making now, and that have certainly shaped his rise to power.
Well, and that political history also includes the fact that tariffs affect different parts of the country and different parts of the
Right.
economy
Yep. Yep.
differently.
Yep.
And I want to take us back to my favorite tariff, which is the 1828 tariff of abominations. Why is this my favorite tariff? Because I actually read a whole bunch of books on it, and they asked a question about it in my written exams when I was in graduate school, and I answered it beautifully. But in 1828, Andrew Jackson passes a whole bunch of tariffs to protect the now nascent American industrial sector. And the slaveholding South goes berserk. Why? Because they import all their finished goods and they export all their raw goods. They're a basically agricultural economy that doesn't want to devote any of their resources to manufacturing. In fact, they actually hate manufacturing and
Yep.
they think it's wrong. And so Jackson imposes this tariff, and